Welcome back to the gumbo table. The first double slide is a couple of pictures I snapped almost 23 years ago during the street actions of the 2000 Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles. Another dreary installment in our ongoing charade of electoral politics. This one nominating Al Gore, corporate whore, as I heard him referred to by the protesters beneath the Santa Monica Pier, where a high-end fundraiser for Gore was being held the night before the convention. On the left of that double photo is Jello Biafra, one of the early punk band, the Dead Kennedys. And on the right, looking a little chagrined, is the recently deceased David Crosby, formerly of the seminal folk rock band The Byrds, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and sometimes Young, an erstwhile political gadfly. I recently recounted this story to my high school friend Leslie, who lives a couple of hours away in Santa Barbara now, and who was genuinely saddened by Crosby's passing, his sweet melodies having touched her heart over the years. I myself was very fond of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, having been introduced to them by my cousin George, who came back to live with us after graduating from Boys Town. It was the great live album Four-Way Street that first got my attention. The encounter took place at Bob Hope Patriotic Hall in downtown Los Angeles. That was where the relatively unknown Arianna Huffington was holding the shadow convention, as she would also do for the Republicans in Philadelphia that year. All I knew about her at the time was her conservative Republican husband had run unsuccessfully for the U.S. Senate in California and had come out of the closet sometime after that. The shadow convention was more or less a festival of activists and people disenchanted with the left-right paradigm. I got someone, I got some one-on-one time with two such luminaries, Robert Anderson and Fred Harris. Anderson had broken with the Reagan Republicans and ran as an independent in 1980, garnering 6.6% of the vote. Fred Harris was a U.S. Senator from Oklahoma whose then wife, LaDonna, I had voted for vice president in 1980 on the Citizens Party ticket. LaDonna and Fred are still with us today in their 90s. LaDonna made some waves a few years back, adopting Johnny Depp into her Comanche tribe after a very questionable turn as Tonto in The Lone Ranger. My own primary concern then was globalism. The issue had perhaps unexpectedly blown up as the first internet organized event of its type a year earlier at the 1999 so-called Battle of Seattle, during the meeting of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Even then, I did not fit easily into left-right categories. Checking out any figure or organization who seemed opposed to globalism, from Ross Perot to that year's Green Party standard bearer Ralph Nader, and later Ron Paul. So that's how I became a member of the Green Party for a few years. Even running for at-large city council member in Anaheim, California, the home of Disneyland, although I was not much of an environmentalist at all. These days, I believe only in Messiah and have no use for any political party. And that's one of my yard signs right there. That particular afternoon, I was at the Bob Hope Patriotic Hall with my daughter Rosalina to hear 90-year-old Doris Granny D. Haddock speak. She is pictured in this slideshow with my daughter, who was 20 at the time. I was in my 40s and more idealistic than I'd ever been. Granny D had gained fame walking across the entirety of America in her 90th year to call attention to campaign finance reform. I now realize that nothing will change the power structure except the return of Messiah. David Crosby was introducing Granny D, and I was surprised to see him there, not realizing he was much interested in politics. My image of him being a gun-toting, hell-raising rocker with a pretty nasty substance abuse problem. After taking the podium, Granny D accidentally referred to David Crosby as Bob Crosby about 2 or 3 times. It was an honest mistake. Bob Crosby was the leader of a Dixieland jazz octet in Doris's younger days and the little brother of the original crooner Bing Crosby. So when David Crosby passed in front of me a little while later, I couldn't resist being a smart aleck, pointing at him and saying, "Oh my gosh, there goes Bob Crosby." That's when he looked up with that miffed expression and I snapped his picture. We'll get back to Dave McGowan's take on David Crosby, who David Crosby really was, in just a moment. But that week at the Democratic convention was quite an adventure. We managed to get ourselves batoned by police, shot at with rubber bullets, during a wild melee that followed the police unplugging of Rage Against the Machine in the protest pit. The police had taken this measure because several fires had been started in the pit, the ones I saw with my own eyes apparently done by agents provocateur who looked like they were just out of prison and didn't blend in very well with the New Age hippie protesters at all. My daughter, who then did not realize the potential gravity of such situations, confronted them with the fire lighting, and they surrounded us, and I felt we were lucky to back out of that situation unscathed with a few diffusing words. We even got our picture in the LA Times, the one that had Ted and Caroline Kennedy on the front page to boot. When the slide comes up, that's me next to my daughter laying down, melodramatically raising my arms. Moments after that picture was taken, the police dangerously squeezed this large crowd of us together and closed our exit. I suppose they were trying to make a point, but it was pretty scary at the time. I remember 3 young women diffusing the tension by singing an old civil rights song, "We will not bow down to oppression. We will not bow down to injustice. We will not bow down to exploitation. We gonna stand, we will stand." Well, I guess there is some power in music because that lowered the fear level that was rising rapidly. That brush with political media was a far cry from my first one as a child on a local New Orleans newscast, shaking hands with, of all people, George Corley Wallace as he bound out of the VIP room at what is now Louis Armstrong Airport in March 1968. He was still 4 years away from the wheelchair that would bind him for another 26 years. He had the most electric atmosphere that to this day I have ever encountered around anybody. George Wallace didn't give much thought to anything he did or the consequences or how they affected people. At that point in his life, he was all action and attention seeking. Dave McGowan's weird scenes inside the canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the dark heart of the hippie dream, is one of those essential books to have on your shelf if you're going to understand the kind of world you're living in. Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles, not San Francisco, was the actual birthplace of the hippie movement. It was an outgrowth in large measure from the folk revival and folk rock scenes. They in turn developed from anthropology, folklore, and Carl Jung scholarship with an objective, I believe, of resurrecting the old gods. For some reason, this scene uprooted itself from the East Coast. Many of the central figures from the Washington, D.C. area caravanning out to the Los Angeles area where there was no music scene to speak of. And then, all of a sudden, there was. And many of the people involved came from families with a military, intelligence, and/or blue blood lineage. David Crosby was from one such lineage. Like significant culture creative Humphrey Bogart, whom we covered in our video on Gangsta Cool, David Van Cortlandt Crosby was from wealthy Dutch New York stock, a confluence of the powerful Van Cortlandt, Van Schuyler, and Van Rensselaer families of upstate New York. He was the son of Annapolis graduate and World War II military intelligence officer Major Floyd Delafield Crosby. Like many other rock star family members suspected of intelligence affiliation, Floyd Crosby traveled the world quite a bit after the military, including Haiti in 1927, where one of the occupying U.S. officers was the father of Mamas and Papas founder John Phillips. According to McGowan, Crosby's family tree included many people at the highest level of power in American society. U.S. senators and congressmen, state senators, governors, mayors, judges, Supreme Court justices, Revolutionary and Civil War generals, signers of the Declaration of Independence, and members of the Continental Congress, and a number of high-ranking Freemasons like Stephen Van Rensselaer III, reportedly the former Grand Master of Masons for the state of New York. Additionally, David Crosby was a direct descendant of Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. McGowan goes on to say that if there is a network of elite families that have shaped the national and world events for a very long time, then it's safe to say David Crosby is a bloodline member of that clan. And if America had royalty, then David Crosby would probably be a duke or a prince or something similar. Little wonder that he was so sought after as a sperm donor to stars like Melissa Etheridge, her son tragically dead from a Crosby-level drug addiction. Terry Melcher once said, "I'd have to say that personally speaking, Crosby was worse for good feelings of the local rock and roll scene than Charles Manson was." Melcher was in a position to know. Not only was he the son of Doris Day and the producer of Crosby's band, the Byrds, but was also the owner of the house in which the Manson murders took place. Melcher played a major role in launching not only the Byrds' career and the Laurel Canyon music scene, but the worldwide youth counterculture movement that accompanied it. Not exactly the prototype peace and love hippie, David Crosby had a predilection for handguns and kept a huge collection of guns all of his life. McGowan, quoting Crosby's autobiography, says that the unprecedented mass appeal of the new rock and roll gave the singers a voice in public affairs. McGowan notes that this, of course, makes it all the more curious that these icons were to an overwhelming degree the sons and daughters of the military intelligence complex and the scions of families that have wielded vast wealth and power in this country for a very long time. He asked, "Are we to believe that that only kids The only kids from that era who had musical talent were the sons and daughters of Navy admirals, chemical warfare engineers, and Air Force intelligence officers. Or are they just the ones who were signed to lucrative contracts and relentlessly promoted by their labels and the media? Looked at as rebels, David Crosby and Stephen Stills have never disowned the family values they were raised with. Crosby was close to Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper and was himself the prototype for Dennis Hopper's character in Easy Rider. Crosby's motorcycle was a gift from Peter Fonda. As an interesting aside, the Fondas were another New York Dutch aristocratic family. They came to America in the 1600s on a boat owned by one of David Crosby's ancestors. The Byrds' bassist Chris Hillman's house was one of many that mysteriously burned down to the ground in Laurel Canyon. Hillman's did so shortly after a visit by David Crosby. Hillman said, "I can't connect it yet, where the Satan factor came into play with David, but I'm working on it." Crosby noted that the DEA could have popped me for interstate transport of dope or dealing lots of times, but never did. In this, he had the same kind of luck as Papa John Phillips, who was looking at 45 years for trafficking pharmaceuticals and served 30 days. When Crosby, Stills, and Nash first got together, they called themselves the Frozen Noses because of their fondness for cocaine. Crosby was close to many members of the Hells Angels. The consensus seems to be that most of the Byrds, especially Crosby, could not play the instruments and were entirely a manufactured product of their manager, Jim Dixon. So this has all the markings of social engineering, but to what end or purpose? Well, look at what did ensue. We have come to this counter-Christ, sex and drugs and hedonism, do as thou wilt culture, which ironically terminates in a rigidly controlled socialist dictatorship. Maybe all that military intelligence blue blood was not an accident. This is Gumbo Craig, and this is Future Visions and Distant Echoes. Please keep an eye on this channel. We've got some really interesting, useful information coming up here in 2023. Until then, remind yourself that Almighty Yah is the source of all good things. So all glory to the Most High Elohim. Shalom.